Thank you for the invitation here today, and it's great to hear everyone's papers and see all the work. The presentation I'm going to today is called The Projection of the City, How Time-Based Media Redefines the Agency of Mapping. And I'm positing that historically the urban map has been an object of instant obsolescence, whether depicting what is or what could be. These realities and fantasies, once manifest in a document, are immediately historic artifacts, out of date with the actively changing urbanities or political whims that they depict. And so as an example, I've taken two readings of Washington, D.C. One is a tourist map, and the other is a picture of the 2017 Historic Women's March. So the map as a fixed representation or a snapshot is at odds with the very nature of space at the urban scale. Here we see a tourist map of Washington, D.C., complete with its many landmarks, paired with a map of the historic 2017 Women's March following Trump's election. During the event itself, the urban space transformed, but maybe more importantly, in its aftermath, the city and nation and even world to some extent transformed, producing a new cultural consciousness around feminist issues, leading to the growth of the Me Too movement and a general call for accountability. And so part of the kind of question that I'm asking here is how can a map reflect seismic cultural change on this level? And so in some ways, GIS has answered that question for us. The recent introduction of real-time mapping applications run on GIS fundamentally changed our conception of mapping, in that maps can now represent the ever-changing present through the harnessing of data. So GIS allows us to layer different systems and different pieces of knowledge in order to gain new understandings of the city. And in the case of many applications, this kind of big data is harnessed to give us a kind of second layer or transitory layer of information that we see in relationship to the city. But however adept such platforms are at collecting traffic data, road closures, events, little of the vitality of urban spaces can be gleaned from these services. And so in defining this project, I looked to James Corner's seminal paper, The Agency of Mapping, Speculation, Critique, and Invention, in which Corner critiques maps that are tracings, which is to say that they relay spatial relationships, and his words simply reproduce what is already known. But Corner goes through a number of examples and uncovers for us the potential of multiplicity, montage, and hybridization in conveying the contemporary city. And he says that another way one can characterize the multiplying functions of layering is in terms of indeterminacy. Unlike a traditional plan, the layered field remains open to any number of interpretations, uses, and transformations in time. How can contemporary technology and media extend Corner's ideas about layering and indeterminacy? And how can they connect with the ideas presented by Kevin Lynch? So the idea of a layered and changing city and accompanying mapping builds on the perceptual city celebrated by Kevin Lynch. In the image of the city, Lynch describes the city as one made of shifting images, rather than a single comprehensive image for the entire environment. There seems to be a set of images which more or less overlap or interrelate. And so the project that I'm going to present deals with this idea of a multiplicitous and changing city, particularly in relationship to an event scenario. So the project takes up the question of how mapping might gain new agency in a time when visualization itself is able to transform. And the context of this inquiry is in an academic design studio investigating disaster relief in the immediate aftermath of a real-world event. So here you see a picture of a debris flow event that happened in the aftermath of fires in 2017. And so after these heavy fires burned up the mountains, heavy rain essentially caused the landscape to collapse upon itself, destroying hundreds of homes and taking fatalities in its wake. And so when you have such a kind of loaded event where not only do you have the kind of case of fatality and the case of destruction, but you also have a permanently changed topographic zone, a lot of questions arise about how you map and understand the space, because even the kind of cleanup efforts are not going to repair that new ground line. So because disaster produces dramatic change during a short window of time, the issue of mapping becomes central. And in this particular disaster study, the information was not very accessible because of the smallness or remoteness of the community affected. And so in studying this event, I had my students look at a variety of sources from real-time GIS data to social media streams. And so here you see some of the kind of mix between traditional news sites, emergency relief sites, and just average citizens conveying updates around this disaster. And the reality is that today's disaster scenarios, which seem to be more and more frequent, are really told in this way. The news that comes online on social media comes much faster and requires less referencing than traditional news media. So the freshness of the event study, the closure of road access and its aftermath, and the lack of media coverage due to the smallness of the community affected made for a situation in which affected citizens had to rely on social media streams and infrequent news reporting to obtain information. And social media streams become important as immediate, urgent, and consistent sources rather than mainstream news. So students studying the event also access real-time data streams used by emergency relief facilities. And so part of the challenge to students was to connect the kind of first-hand account information with the real geographic mapping. So the first step that the students undertook was a traditional static mapping. Because of the displacement of land in the event, the topographic data rendered from public geospatial databases had become obsolete, and strategies had to be developed to convey the shifting land mass. In this way, mapping became a tool not only for visualization, but for the identification and processing of new spatial configurations. The total destruction of localized geographic regions was at once both a source of melancholy and opportunity. And so here in this map you see the kind of path and timeline of the disaster, with material relocating from its mountain site into this basin along the coast, and then immediately being picked up by emergency crews and redistributed in quite far distances across the state of California. Students also produced timelines, which again were these kind of static images gathering information that had already been collected, that traced the events from the initial fire all the way to the disaster relief efforts. And so the daily life of the affected community was quick to develop new nodes and paths, and the well-established positioning of social centers, school locations, and commercial spaces could no longer function. The rapid realignment of activity suggested new corridors for public life, with variable potential over the long term. So some of the questions that arise out of a situation where your cultural centers are rapidly changing is whether this is a temporary or permanent solution and what the opportunities are in that aftermath. So this slide shows one of the projected maps, and so students were tasked mapping the disaster over time and space after making their static maps, and they used digital projection onto a physical model to convey both the event and the urbanistic and infrastructural potentials of its aftermath. So part of the challenge was to actually harness real-time as the main consideration. Using real-time data streams connected to their projection system in order to produce a map that was constantly changing. Another major element in the media coverage gathered by the students was the emotional component of the material. And so many lives were lost in the particular disaster, and the relatively small community of Montecito is devastated. So as a group of students familiarizing themselves with this event and then designing for the future community, it was important for them to connect with it on an emotional level, as well as to communicate the gravitas of the situation to critics and others and the community that they actually work with, who would be viewing and critiquing their projects. So the use of news clips and sound bites projected onto the mapping exercise allowed for students to create an emotional reading of the project, overlaid with other mapping data. And so in the case of this project, students attempted to geolocate various news clips in relationships to where they had been filmed, and then place them on the topographic model. And so by controlling the speed and directions in which the clips were played, students were able to draw attention to different visuals and place emphasis in a controlled way. For example, clips of the Thomas Fire or a plane dropping fire retardant are things that we've all seen on the news. But when played backwards, our perspective of the material is transformed, and we view it with a new and almost mesmerizing intensity. And this goes for the kind of depiction between the relationship between location and the clip as well. These emotional understandings of the data affected the design component of the project in various ways. For example, large boulders, some the size of SUVs, were released during the debris flow and took many lives. It became the students' responsibility to both accurately convey an understanding of the scale of this material, as well as the recent history of these artifacts and the death and destruction they caused. These boulders were prime material for use in reconstruction, but the question was raised as to how much value we as a society assign to the memories of these physical artifacts. So if a boulder that came down the mountain destroyed houses, is the memory embodied in that object something that we can use or that we need to discard? Is the disaster transformed or erased? And do we have a responsibility as designers to grapple with this question and address it through our treatment of material? So in this video, the relationship between space and emotion is much less controlled, where the students are using spilled ink to replicate the kind of geography and path of the debris flow, and then intersplicing it with news clips and people telling their stories. So I'll take the next couple minutes to show several of these videos, which you can also see on display in the other room. So the ink being projected onto the topographical model produces this renewed emotion and experience of the disaster.
I'm not going anywhere. Here comes the flash flood. Get out of here, go! Oh my God, Mom! Close the door! Wake Dad up!
Well, once the boulders and trees came through our house, we climbed up on the roof and waited until the creek went down a bit, and then we climbed off the roof and got to our neighbor's garage, and we just got pulled out of there by the firefighters now. But he's been out rescuing neighbors.
We saw us cleaning the drains, and I heard the rumble of the rocks, and I looked over at the river, and the trees were just coming down, choo, choo, choo. And we ran into the house, and right then, the boulder busted through our house. And we got upstairs, and we got up to about 8 feet, 9 feet up the stairs, and we were able to crawl the window to the roof. The house was wiped out, just took everything out. And then later, we were worried about a neighbor's house, and we went over to see. I went over to see if they were okay, and we heard a little baby crying. And found the kid, we dug down, found a little baby. I don't know where it came from. We got it out, got the blood out, it's out. I hope it's okay to take it right to the hospital. It was just a baby 4 feet down in the mud, and no. Under the rocks. I'm glad we can. But who knows what it is.
So the video conveys this relationship between the physical presence of the mud, which you see both projected as ink, as well as on the face of the figures speaking. And conflates this idea of emotion with mapping. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to show the one video and the other is an exhibition. But I'll conclude by saying that in this study, the interplay of projected data and physical topography translating between the digital and the analog allowed for a focus on the connotative, signifying or suggesting an association or secondary meaning, as opposed to the purely denotative. The resulting maps attempt to bring time and its accompanying emotion into the field of mapping. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Questions or comments? I have one. One thing is the video you showed and the way you described the word, there's quite a bit of going on limits. There's also the students are grappling with the material that you're asking them to do. And I'm just wondering, like, once they've done an exercise like this, like, how do what you call mapping lend itself to a reconfiguration of a spatial understanding of the site, or does the work continue into other phases? The students are maybe go back to more traditional design means of exploring their site.
Yeah, that's a great question. So this was the introductory exercise into the studio. The students went on to do design interventions on 2 levels. One was using the debris from the disaster as building blocks for new architecture. And the other was to design a public infrastructure that could accommodate future debris flows, as well as produce something that could be used the majority of the time, since these events are very infrequent. And so the students' understanding of these interventions was definitely shaped by the mapping. So some were really interested in the opportunities that the GIS work revealed in terms of social corridors, cultural nodes, places where all the infrastructure for urban life is there, but it hasn't quite happened yet. And some really took to the kind of emotional side, which really grew out of their research through social media. So when you have research or information filtered through the human lens, it becomes, kind of necessarily overshadowed or viewed with this strong emotional pull.
Thank you for this presentation. I was curious, because you talk about mapping, yet it's projected onto to the physical model, at least what you showed now and what's in the exhibition, and perhaps that's your phone. and perhaps there were other proposals within the student group, but I'm wondering how the physicality of the map, and if we don't see a model, so this third dimension and this object as a map, is something that for you perhaps augments the reading of the data or changes, like how does the actual object of the model take place on the map, or what does it do differently?
Sure, yeah, it's a great question. So kind of part of the intention of the physical model coming together with this projected or changed information was that not only did the kind of context change in the backstory of the project, but also the students were ultimately going to be proposing work in this site, right, that transformed the landscape. So the ultimate interventions also mapped to the model. And so it was a way of kind of grappling with the topography from the beginning and then experimenting with how you could change the topography through the way you projected on it without physically changing it. And so, yeah, I think that some interesting things come out of it in terms of how much you can propose or how much you can, look at something over time, because it allows you to not produce multiple artifacts, but to produce multiple layers of information that can be added or subtracted as needed.
My other question is about what you're presenting as a real-time transformation of mapping. And what we kind of understand that is like from my what I would understand there is, for example, traffic map that changes in real time, and therefore access and mobility across the city is being transformed by the act of mapping that in real time. And I'm just wondering, in this case, because the students, if I understand, are working after the event with data from the past. So they're using data that was generated at the moment of the event, and yet a little further in the future. What's the consideration for this type of work for actual real-time mapping of the event? The stream of social media we saw is one that people are sent from their phone, they're always geolocated. It's not until the content of the mention, perhaps, that you're looking at, but where that message is being sent from. Does that have any, is there a way to, how does this data that is geolocated will change the way that people in real time, affected by the events, actually know where is safe, where are shelters, what's happening in such an event? Is that part of the research? Because that's what we've saw seems to be an interpretation of an event already passed.
Yeah, so that's actually kind of part of it. The event happened right before the semester started, but the aftermath of the event, as with, I suppose, any disaster scenario, continues for days, weeks, months afterwards. So they were within the same week of, studio began within the same week of the disaster, and still information was trickling out. The locations of destroyed properties, the locations of bodies, whether people could get out of their houses if they were stranded. So a lot of that information was still real time, coming out as they produced these interpretations and studies and maps. And part of it, I think, what we experience as citizens today is a city that we understand through social media, through apps, through Waze and Google and Yelp. And so actually a lot of our geographic data does come from that, even if it's not specifically a map. So part of the kind of question of the project was, can we translate these various streams of information we get into a map that's complex and layered, like our physical experience of the city? Thanks.
Thank you, Keith.